Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to get up to speed on important research without having to wade through all the jargon yourself. Today, we're digging into something pretty crucial for, well, the future of getting around. How to make sure autonomous vehicles and us, human drivers, can actually share the roads safely, especially, in those really high-stakes, tricky situations. We've got this really interesting paper that tries to tackle this head-on. It's trying to get into the cognitive circuits, maybe, the nuts and bolts of how we make decisions behind the wheel when things get dicey.
Right. And the big idea is to build a framework of something AI can use to kind of predict our often unpredictable behavior. Because, for these AVs to really work in the real world, just following traffic laws isn't enough. Not by a long shot.
No.
They really need a deeper grasp of human behavior, especially how we see risk and how we make those split-second choices. And this paper, it presents a pretty novel way to model that complexity. It feels like a real step forward.
Okay, so the paper's goal is this framework, capturing both how, I might assess risk versus how you might, but also finding the common ground, the patterns in how we all decide things.
Exactly. Bridging that gap.
And they've got two main parts to this, a risk sensitivity model and something called the drift diffusion model for the decision-making part.
That's right, the DDM. The aim is really to help AVs get much better at anticipating and reacting to what actually happens out there.
Before we dive into the specifics of this paper's models, maybe we could take a quick step back. Like, how did we even get here in terms of modeling drivers for AI?
Yeah, good idea. It's been quite an evolution. Early on in AI and robotics, a lot of it was rule-based, super simple stuff.
Like, if this happens, do that.
Pretty much. If car ahead brakes, then brake.
Yeah.
But real driving, it's messy, it's uncertain. Those simple rules just break down really quickly.
Right. Anything unexpected throws them off completely.
Absolutely. Think about it. A pedestrian steps out, someone cuts you off aggressively. A simple rule often just doesn't cut it. You need anticipation, judgment. So then we saw people trying other things. Behavioral simulation models came along. They try to mimic driving actions, but often don't really explain the why behind them. Then you had game theoretic models. They often assume drivers are perfectly rational actors, always optimizing.
Which anyone who's driven in traffic knows isn't always true.
Chuckle slightly, exactly. Then there are social force models.
Yeah.
Kind of imagine drivers pushed and pulled by virtual forces. Interesting idea, but maybe oversimplifies the thinking part. And even, modern machine learning from huge data sets. It can find patterns, definitely, but sometimes it's a bit of a black box. You don't always understand why the AI made a particular decision.
So it sounds like all these previous attempts gave us pieces, but this paper is really trying to focus on the thinking process itself, especially in those risky moments.
That's the core idea. It builds on what are called information cognition models, and specifically the drift diffusion model, or DDM.
Okay, the DDM.
Yeah, the basic concept is that when we face a choice, our brain doesn't just flip a switch. It gradually gathers evidence, information, pushing us towards one option or another.
Like weighing the pros and cons, but really fast.
Kind of, until the evidence for one option hits a certain threshold, and boom, decision made, action taken. So what this paper really contributes is, 1, building a DDM specifically for these high-risk driving choices. 2, creating this clever model of individual driver risk sensitivity using a multivariate Gaussian distribution.
Okay, that sounds technical. Multivariate Gaussian.
Yeah, it's basically a sophisticated way to map out someone's unique blend of risk attitudes across different factors, not just one single score. And 3rd, they tested these models really thoroughly using driving simulator experiments.
Right. Simulators seem essential for this. You can't exactly stage real near misses on the highway for research.
Definitely not. They recruited 58 licensed drivers, put them in a pretty advanced simulator, and they designed scenarios based on actual accident data from places like NHTSA. Things like sudden cut-ins, that's a lateral risk, potential rear-enders, longitudinal risk, and tricky lane changes where you're juggling multiple things.
And they varied the situations too, right? Like how fast the other car cuts in.
Exactly. They changed timings, vehicle behaviors, trying to capture the nuances of how people respond.
And they were tracking a ton of data points, not just whether they crashed.
Oh, yeah. Very detailed.
Yeah.
They measured things like cognitive reaction time, just how long it takes to even notice the hazard. Then brake reaction time, speed adjustment time.
How hard they braked.
Yep, maximum deceleration. Also minimum time to collision, how close they actually got. And even steering, the maximum steering angle used.
Wow.
And critically, they found big differences between drivers, even in the exact same setup. Some braked hard, some swerved, some did a mix. really underlines why you need to model that individual variability.
Okay, so let's unpack that risk sensitivity part more. How did they actually quantify how sensitive someone is to risk?
So they defined it based on how someone responds to uncertainty and potential danger. And they measured it using concrete driving actions, vehicle kinematics.
Like speed and acceleration.
Precisely. Things like the speed when they start braking, how much they accelerate or decelerate forwards and backwards, and also side to side, the lateral acceleration. Based on patterns in this data, they grouped drivers into sort of high, medium, and low risk sensitivity profiles.
Okay.
But it's not just one dimension. That's where the multivariate Gaussian distribution, the MGD, comes in. That lets them model how these different factors, braking speed, longitudinal acceleration, lateral acceleration, combine to create a unique risk fingerprint for each driver.
Got it. So it's not just risky or cautious, but how they are risky or cautious across different maneuvers?
You've got it. It captures that blend. They used statistical methods, maximum likelihood estimation, to fit these MGD models to their simulator data for each scenario. And the results lined up pretty well with what you'd expect. Like in the cut-in scenario, most drivers hit the brakes pretty quickly, so the distribution of braking responses was relatively tight. But for potential rear-end collisions, there was more spread, some braked super hard, others were more gradual. It matched observed behaviors.
Makes sense. Some people just slam the brakes faster. Okay, so they have this way to profile individual risk sensitivity. How does that connect back to the drift diffusion model, the DDM, for the actual decision?
Right. So the DDM models, the evidence accumulation process we talked about, are you going to brake or swerve? The DDM pictures your brain gathering evidence for each option.
Like point scoring for brake versus swerve.
Sort of, yeah. The drift rate in the DDM is how fast that evidence piles up. A higher drift rate means you're accumulating evidence faster, heading towards a decision quicker. Then you have the boundary settings, that's the threshold. How much evidence do you need before you commit to braking or commit to swerving?
Okay.
There's also initial bias. Maybe you start slightly leaning towards braking anyway, and non-decision time. That accounts for the basic time lag for perception and actually moving your foot or hands.
And they built mathematical formulas for all these DDM parts for their scenarios, using things like speed and distance.
Yes, quite detailed. For the cut-in, for instance, the drift rate towards braking might depend on how fast the other car is moving over and how much space is left. The decision boundaries are also modeled mathematically, often using something like a softmax function to represent the probability of choosing one action over another based on the situation.
And the initial bias, could that depend on how fast you were going to begin with?
Exactly. They modeled initial bias potentially based on your starting speed. Maybe if you're going faster, you have less bias towards hard braking initially. It's quite nuanced.
And then this is the key part. They linked this DDM framework back to the individual risk sensitivity profiles.
Precisely. This is where it gets personalized. Someone modeled as highly risk sensitive might have, say, a generally higher drift rate. They process the danger faster. And maybe lower decision boundaries. They need less evidence to trigger a strong reaction like braking hard.
While someone less risk sensitive might accumulate evidence slower, need more convincing before they act decisively.
That's the idea. They developed equations showing how an individual's calculated risk sensitivity level directly influences their drift rate, their decision boundaries, maybe even their initial bias in the DDM.
Okay, so how did they check if this whole integrated model actually worked?
Validation is key, right? They used their simulator data. They took a library called PDDM and used an optimization technique, differential evolution, to find the specific DDM parameter values, drift rates, boundaries, etc., for each scenario that best matched the actual decisions and reaction times of their human drivers.
So tuning the model to the real data.
Exactly. And then they checked. How well does the tuned model predict the distribution of response times they actually saw? They looked at cumulative probability plots, comparing the model's predictions with the real data.
Did it match up?
Yeah, they reported a really strong correspondence. It suggested the model was doing a good job capturing those underlying cognitive decision processes.
That's impressive. Did they just stop there, or did they use the model to understand the decisions better?
They went further. They grouped the data, like all the drivers who started at a certain speed range and ran simulations with their calibrated DDM. This gave them insights into the typical decision process in each scenario.
What did they find?
Well, for the cut-in, the model confirmed that braking is the dominant strategy, especially at lower speeds. The DDM simulation suggested that, while steering might be briefly considered, the evidence for braking just accumulates much faster and hits the threshold first for most people.
Okay.
For the rear-end threat, The model showed that while braking is still common, especially at lower speeds, the chance of choosing to steer increases as the driver's own speed goes up, which kind of makes intuitive sense. More speed, maybe steering seems like a better escape.
Right, less time to stop.
And for the lane-changing scenario, it was more balanced. The model suggested drivers were weighing braking versus steering more evenly, and initial speed didn't seem to push them strongly one way or the other. They're managing multiple factors simultaneously.
And they also looked at how the individual risk sensitivity changed things within those scenarios.
Yes. They showed simulations where they specifically adjusted the risk sensitivity input. You could see how a high sensitivity profile led to faster evidence accumulation, steeper drift, and hitting the decision threshold sooner compared to a low sensitivity profile. It really visualized that personalization aspect.
Cool. So how did this whole DDM approach compare to older models like the ones you mentioned earlier?
The comparison. They tested it against some established models, IDM, mobile, GIPS, specifically in that cut-in scenario.
And how did it stack up?
The DDM came out looking pretty good. While some of the classic models did okay at lower speeds, the DDM was significantly better, especially as speeds increased and the situation got riskier.
What went wrong with the older models?
Some struggled to predict the lane change decisions accurately in those riskier setups, or they ended up with higher simulated collision rates. The DDM, because its parameters like drift rate and boundaries can adapt based on the perceived risk and the individual sensitivity, seemed much better at predicting the kind of collision avoidance maneuvers people actually make.
So the adaptability is key.
It really highlights the advantage of incorporating these cognitive dynamics, that thinking process, rather than just having fixed rules or simpler reactive models.
Okay, so pulling it all together, the big takeaway seems to be that this research offers a much more nuanced, quantifiable way to understand how different drivers perceive risk and make those crucial decisions.
Right. It gives us tools to model individual differences.
And the drip diffusion model provides a framework that seems to capture that gradual decision process better than just simple reactive models. Plus, integrating the risk sensitivity into the DDM allows for predictions tailored to individual drivers, or at least driver types.
Yes, that personalization is a major step.
And the simulator studies were absolutely crucial for actually testing and validating all of this in scenarios that felt real but were safe.
Couldn't have done it otherwise.
But the implications for AVs, well, they seem pretty significant, designing autonomous cars that are safer because they can better anticipate human actions.
Absolutely. It's about improving safety and predictability in that mixed traffic environment we'll have for a long time. Developing AVs that maybe drive in a way that feels more natural, more adaptive to the humans around them.
Could it even be used for driver training? Or maybe evaluating drivers?
Potentially, yeah.
All right.
Or informing how we design the interfaces, the HMIs, for when humans and AVs need to interact or hand over control. It really contributes to building more robust, reliable, autonomous systems that can handle those really complex, high-risk edge cases.
It feels like understanding this cognitive layer is fundamental if we want humans and AVs to coexist smoothly and safely.
Couldn't agree more. It's essential for building trust.
All right, fantastic discussion. Now it's time for our Novel Notions segment. This is where we take the core ideas from the paper and brainstorm a bit. What are some potential next steps, related research ideas this sparks? What jumps out at you?
Well, building directly on this cognitive modeling, one really fascinating direction, I think, would be to integrate real-time physiological data directly into the DDM.
Physiological, like heart rate.
Exactly. Imagine an AV with sensors maybe tracking eye movements for attention or cognitive load, maybe skin conductance or heart rate variability for stress levels.
Yeah.
Especially relevant in handover situations, right?
Okay.
So this real-time physiological info could then dynamically adjust the DDM parameters. Let's say the car detects your stress level spiking as you approach a really complex intersection where you might need to take over. The AV's decision model could then proactively become more cautious. Maybe it raises the decision boundary for making a lane change, or it demands a larger gap before accepting it. It adapts based on your sensed state.
Wow, a car that senses your stress and changes how it drives.
Kind of, yeah. There's neuroscience research linking physiological arousal to decision-making under uncertainty that could inform this, the impact. Potentially much safer, more intuitive handovers, and AVs that behave more appropriately in emotionally charged or stressful driving moments.
That's a really compelling idea, an empathetic car almost. What else comes to mind?
Another angle could be using this framework, the risk sensitivity profiling and the DDM, to understand and maybe even mitigate aggressive driving in human drivers.
How would that work?
Imagine your car, equipped with sensors, and this cognitive model is continuously sort of analyzing your driving style, your risk sensitivity, your decision patterns.
Okay, constantly evaluating me.
In a way, if it detects a consistent pattern of really high risk taking, like you consistently have low decision thresholds in the model, you jump into small gaps, brake really late, it could offer subtle personalized feedback.
Feedback, like a warning buzzer.
Maybe more subtle than that. Think nudges, drawing from behavioral economics. Perhaps gentle visual cues on the dash, maybe a slight haptic buzz in the steering wheel when you make a risky choice, according to the model, or even carefully worded auditory prompts. Not annoying alarms, but gentle guidance.
Nudging you towards safer habits.
Exactly. The goal wouldn't be just to warn, but to actively shape safer driving behavior over time. The potential benefit: reducing accidents caused by human aggression or recklessness, and creating driver assistance systems that are truly intelligent coaches, not just nags.
Those are both really fascinating directions. It really makes you think, doesn't it, how deeply intertwined these cognitive models become with the act of driving itself, and how that could fundamentally reshape our ideas about road safety and even responsibility in an era of increasingly autonomous vehicles. Definitely gives you something to chew on. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. As always, if you want to explore the research yourself, the link to the full paper is right there in the description. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.